Okay, good morning. Today is January 22nd. And as a follow-up to last week we talked about the buyer's agreement, Form 41, and the John L. Scott buyer's agreement. So today, it just seemed very fitting to talk about how we would amend those agreements should we need to. So we will be talking about Form 41A, which is the Northwest MLS amendment to the buyer agreement. We'll be talking about the John L. Scott version, which is the JLS AF 41A. And then touching very lightly, because hopefully this won't come up, but the termination of your buyer agreement if necessary. Okay, so why do we need to amend the agreement in the first place? Well, basically, this agreement is going to be in place until it is either fulfilled or amended, right? So to amend it, we are going to be using that to extend the term. So the length of time, we would use it to change an agency relationship from exclusive to non-exclusive. We would change it to add another broker, like a co-broker, and later we'll talk about why this is important. And then also to consent to dual agency. And then lastly, we want to make sure that whatever we obligate our buyer to in our purchase and sale matches what they're obligated to in our private buyer agreement. So we're going to be using this form if the compensation that you've written down does not match the purchase and sale agreement. All right. So a quick recap of agency relationship, because everything does kind of circle right back to the agency law pamphlet. That is the foundation of how we have to run our business. That's the foundation of why we are signing these forms in the first place. And that is the idea that you only represent somebody if you have a contract saying you represent them. There is no implied relationship. And in doing so, when we represent somebody, we are held to the duties of our buyer's agency and what it says we're supposed to do as representation to them. We are going to work for their best interest. We are going to do nothing that's detrimental to them in the sale. We're going to keep things confidential. We are going to act loyally to them. And then obviously we're going to be disclosing everything to them, turning things in a timely manner. Remember, when we don't represent somebody, we don't necessarily have to keep things confidential. So the first form to talk about, I'm going to just reference the John L. Scott version of the amendment to the buyer agreement. Remember, this form is not available on the Northwest MLS until a later date. I don't actually have that date yet, but until it does become available, I just wanted to remind everybody how to find it. If you find yourself in practice using our John L. Scott forms, you're going to want to go to the madronagroup.com. From there, you're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom where it says Agent Resources. And it's very, very tiny at the very, very bottom. And from Agent Resources, when you scroll down, you'll find this little tab that says Agency Law. Once you click that tab, that's where all the John L. Scott forms are that have to do with the agency buyer representation. So all of ours are linkable with where I've circled. If you want to pull them up, you can save them on your desktop, bring them over to the transaction desk. Keep in mind too that when you fill these out, they're going to have to be filled out in your signing window, not in your creation of the forms with transaction desk. And if you prefer to use the Northwest MLS forms, those are readily available. You don't need to come to the website here to get them. You can pull them straight from transaction desk. Also, in the same tab, I wanted to bring up that we have extensive training and lots of videos to talk about these things with your clients, just to get you more comfortable with how to use these forms, what to say. There's a lot of help when it comes to that. If you haven't had a chance to go through some of these things, there are scripts and dialogues and explanations of everything right here in the same window. So if you find yourself uncomfortable with having this conversation still, please, please, please reach out to these resources. They are all right here for you. All right, going into the John L. Scott, make sure when you pull that agreement up that you are dated at least the 12/22/23, which is the most recent version that we have right now with our John L. Scott amendment. You're going to want to reference the same buyer and the same firm and do everything the same up here, because what you write in this first paragraph refers to the agreement that you've made before. Extending the term is the expiration of your buyer's agency. So if you want to extend it 6 months, you write 6 months. When this ends, that's when the buyer agency agreement ends. Number 2 is agency relationship. And this is a conversation that you're just going to have with whoever you're working with your buyer. When we work with sellers, we're going to have the same conversations. And it's important that you have already gone over what it means to have exclusive versus non-exclusive representation. And in our pamphlet that we have now, the Washington Brokerages in Washington pamphlet, it lays out very, very simply and very, very clear what that means to your buyer. You can, like I said, select either one of these things here. Just make sure that when they do agree to exclusively, I'm not to dual agency yet. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Look at me. Exclusive relationships with you versus a non-exclusive relationship and what that means. I would encourage everybody to do exclusive. And if possible, if there's really pushback on exclusivity, I would ask maybe if there's something else you can change about that contract to maybe put them at a higher comfort level. The non-exclusive is just going to go back to how we acted before this even came around, which was, if you write up the sale, you are entitled to that compensation. Exclusive, as we all know, is your person, whether they find it on their own, whether you find it for them, they are working with you. Keep in mind your area that you've offered to work in has to be the area that you are continuing to show them properties and that you are willing to go to. All right, additional brokers. Think about why we would have an additional broker brought on. One of the examples could be that you have a listing and you found a buyer for your listing. And now you have a buyer and a seller, and your seller does not want you to be a dual agent. You could bring an additional buyer agent on to help represent this person. This would be a category that you'd also fill in if maybe you were going out of town and you needed somebody to show your buyer a few homes. Or during contract, you needed somebody just to kind of take your place while you're out of town or unavailable. This would be a great place to write that in as well. Because again, we are not in a relationship with that buyer unless we have it in a contract. Another good reason that you might use something like this is maybe you need another person. Maybe your personalities clash. You don't want to lose this buyer over something, trivial like that. Or if you have somebody who you want to be your showing agent. So you want to partner with an agent to maybe open up a few doors for you when you can't be there. Their name would go right in this category. And every time they are performing real estate brokerage services to that person, then they are acting as that buyer's agent as well. This doesn't necessarily take the place of you. It just puts them in that relationship along with you. Between the two agents, you'll have to decide what that means as far as compensation between the two of you. That's completely separate from what this signing means. This is really only a way just to show loyalty, if you can think about it that way. If you have somebody who's working with them, you want them to know that they're on their side and the things they talk about can be confidential between the two. Now, limited dual agency is another thing that if they had not previously consented, they can change their mind and consent to you being a dual agent. If you are a dual agent for a buyer, you also need to make sure that whatever seller you are working with also consents to dual agency, or it really can't work. It has to be on both sides. So again, talk with sellers, refer to that with these buyers. I almost think that with everything coming up and the transparency that's been happening, it wouldn't be a bad idea to make a note somewhere, somehow to remind yourself that somebody did or did not consent to dual agency. So if the time or situation comes up, you will know ahead of time whether you have to bring in an additional broker or if you can, in fact, be the dual agent. I'm going to pause on the dual agency for a second here because I also wanted to bring up a few ideas to think about before you just sign off as consenting for dual agency. Keep in mind, along with the duties we have to each client we represent, and the representation, we also have to give them guidance. So as their agent, we're looking out for their best interest. We are doing nothing that's detrimental to them in the sale. So if you're working with two people who you both represent, you are limited in the fact that you can't really do those things in full for either person. Think about negotiations. Think about inspections. If you have a seller who you represent and a buyer who you represent, you being the dual agent, if you attend the inspection, you are essentially seeing the inspection. And did your seller consent to seeing the inspection? Once you know and hear, then you're already liable for the things that are in that, and you've already consented to doing that. Make sure that if there is a dual agency, that your seller also consents fully to seeing the inspection report if you plan on attending that. And think of yourself as a facilitator rather than a representative. So backtracking on that idea too, it might just be in everybody's best interest, including your own, if you find a buyer for your own listing, to simply just refer it out to someone else who can act on their behalf. And then in the John L. Scott version, we have a box number 6 for other. We don't actually have a space in the John L. Scott form to change the compensation. So this would be where you would do it if you're using John L. Scott forms. And you just want to make sure that when you write up your purchase and sale, if you have previously said, you know, I charge 3%, and then you end up negotiating and the listing is only at 2.5, nobody really wants to pay that. You've agreed to let your buyer go ahead and move forward with it. It needs to be changed on here because we are going to be paid as we have contracted. We have to keep our buyer agency contracts on file with our commission disbursement. So we want them to match. So for cleanup purposes, if it's different than the purchase and sale, make sure you're changing it on this amendment. It also takes them away from that obligation of legally and technically having to make up the difference at closing. And it helps with our accounting purposes, really. Okay, 41A, this is the Northwest MLS version of the same exact form. So the same ideas apply to this. The term does default to 60 days. And when you make the extension, you're going to want to make it in number of days. It's the number of days beyond when you sign the agreement, I believe. Actually, I just caught myself with maybe not knowing for sure. I'm going to go ahead and find out for sure that the extension does happen from the date that you sign it, or if it's the date from the agreement originally. So I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to that. Agency relationship, though, again, can be exclusive or non-exclusive. And then an agent who is brought on as a co-agent goes in paragraph 3, just like the John L. Scott one. You can, in the Northwest MLS, have a co-broker be a limited dual agent. This would be if you have a team set up where one of you is going to be acting on the buyer's behalf, one of you is going to be acting on both. But like I said, if that becomes too cumbersome and too cloudy with your duties as an agent, feel free to refer or make it just very clear that you have a buyer contract and a seller contract. And then the Northwest MLS does have a space for the compensation if it needs to be altered, as well as other. And if anybody has anything that they've ever written in the other category, I would love to kind of hear some of those other terms that didn't necessarily get touched on in these forms. I feel like they're pretty inclusive of everything that can be changed. But if there is something that's other, it goes in the other column. Now to terminate the agreement, this just says, okay, we're done working together. This termination is only for, unless you actually both sign this form, then it is only for the services that you provide. So say you have an exclusive buyer agreement and your buyer says, I don't want to work with you anymore. I'm terminating this between us. You both need to actually sign and sever that contract that existed in order for that agency relationship to end. If it is not mutually signed by both people, then technically that agency relationship, whether you continue to communicate with them or not, still exists. Think of it as a listing agreement that they want to cancel off market, but have not terminated the contract with our firm. So if you guys truly want to break ties, you're done working together, you just find that you're not a good fit. When you've exhausted all the resources of trying to refer them to someone else, then you could both sign this and terminate your agreement between the two of you. So why does this even matter? You know, why are we going through all the trouble to even amend these things that have been put into place? You know, what's wrong with just kind of going through with it and just kind of doing things as we want, right? Well, it all comes down to, like I said, all of the tasks, all the duties, all the loyalties that we have go back to the agency relationships that we have with our clients. So we want to do these things so we can make it very clear with our representation. We want to make it very clear with the amount of out-of-pocket expenses our client may have to come to the table with. And because Washington State has a law that requires everything in real estate to be in writing, we do want to make it absolutely clear of their complete obligations. So like I said, with compensation, if that changes, we want to let them know, not only verbally, not only because we're good people, but also in the contract that they are now relieved of their responsibility to pay that difference. We are making sure that everybody our clients talk to knows what they can and can't say. We would never send our buyer into a house with the listing agent there and just let them chit chat away. This is all about transparency, and it's all about just kind of educating our buyers. So there are a few scenarios that I've been looking into and found really, really interesting that have to do with this agency relationship and, you know, obviously the things that happen with the buyer agreement, the things that we could be changing with these amendments. But these things actually came up in the legal hotline. And I thought it was really eye-opening to just kind of put in perspective what our duties are to our clients and where we draw the line with that. So I pulled up these questions, and I would just love everybody to kind of think about these things. And I do have the answers from the legal hotline on these as well. But number one, can a listing broker write up an offer on his own listing for an unrepresented buyer? Can a listing broker write up competing offers on his own listing for multiple unrepresented buyers? Can a listing broker write up an offer for a buyer he represents? Can a listing broker write up competing offers for buyers he does represent? And do I need to change my compensation with 41A if it's different than the purchase and sale agreement? We've already talked about one of those, but according to the legal hotline, Can a listing broker write up an offer for his own listing with an unrepresented buyer? Yes. If you have a seller with a buyer that just walks in, the buyer can remain unrepresented. What do we need to do to make sure that we are fulfilling our duties? We need to give them the agency pamphlet in this case. What about a buyer that multiple offers on unrepresented buyers? Legally, yes, we can do this because we don't represent any of the buyers. We are not guiding those buyers into how much they should offer. We are not contracted with any of those buyers. So if it is simply writing it, then we can legally do so, yes. Now, as far as should we do so and what works best for each buyer and potentially our seller in the long run, you may also want to just refer maybe one or two of those out. Can a listing broker write up an offer for a buyer he does represent? Of course. If there is consent for dual agency from both buyer and seller, then yes, an agent can write up and represent buyer and seller in the same contract, making sure that we are checking the boxes that apply when we do these scenarios on the face of the purchase and sale agreement. Can a listing broker write up competing offers for buyers that he does represent? No. And why not? It goes back to the fact of one of our agency duties is to not make any action that is detrimental to our own client. So if we have a buyer who we represent and another buyer who we represent, they are in direct competition with each other, and there is no way to get around causing a detriment to one of those two buyers. Do I need to change compensation on 41A if it's different than the purchase and sale agreement? Yes, we went over that before. And the reason for that is because we want to just create the consistency with keeping the purchase and sale matching, because in the end, it is a buyer obligation. It is a legal obligation. And especially in the John L. Scott form, it does lay out specifically that if this is different, then it is on the buyer to pay at closing. So if you are not intending on making your buyer pay that difference, please make sure it does match. And all of these scenarios can go back again to us remembering who we represent, remembering the agency relationships that we create, and being as transparent as possible with those we represent. Some things to remember about these buyer agreements and amendments for these buyer agreements. If you're using the John L. Scott forms, you need to be pulling them from the company website. Those are going to be the most updated ones. We cannot use anything that is dated from 2023, or at least hasn't been updated for the new changes. You should be corresponding. You should use the corresponding addendum when you are making these amendments. So if you prefer to use the John L. Scott 41, then please use the John L. Scott 41A. If you're using Northwest MLS, then go ahead and use Northwest MLS. It just kind of creates consistency because they each refer to the form that they were created for. If you are a managing broker or a team leader, you will be a limited dual agent. If you have a smaller team structure, you may want to talk to, either myself or Joe about what that means you can and can't do with that dual agency responsibility. And as managing brokers or team leaders, we need to be really careful if we are advising people from the same, or if we are advising people from our firm who are representing the same transaction. So if you're a managing broker and you have an agent who represents a buyer and an agent who represents a seller, we need to be careful advising because we are also in a limited dual agency capacity. We can help our agents, kind of work through things, but keep in mind too, you're technically a dual agent. Anytime you are terminating a 2023 buyer agency agreement, it can be done with a 53. You may not be a limited dual agent if one party does not consent. So you need to have both people say, yes, this is fine, and then you can do that. All right. So there it is in a nutshell. It's a pretty big nutshell.